Hello, hello, and welcome once again to a Beatles program that we call Things We Said Today. This is a weekly show in which we talk about anything that has to do with the Beatles, anything about their past, anything that might be going on today, whatever we feel like in the moment. I'm Ken Michaels. I'm one of the four co-hosts of the show, also known for my syndicated Beatles program called Every Little Thing and my website, kenmichaelsradio.com, being joined by my three other regular co-hosts. First of all, we have the senior editor for Beatle Fan magazine, that being Al Sussman. Hi, Al.
Hi, Ken. Hello there, everybody.
And also our resident musicologist who writes for a number of different publications, including Beatle Fan, and that being Alan Kozin. Hi, Alan.
Hey, Ken. Hello, everyone.
And also we have the writer for Beatles Examiner, that being Steve Marinucci. Hi, Steve.
Hey, Ken. Hello, everyone.
We have a pretty interesting topic to discuss on today's show, and that is discussing Beatlesque music and artists who are influenced by the Beatles. Before we do that, I just want to make a very quick comment to our listeners, because the last show that we did, which concerned the influence of black artists on the Beatles, we got a tremendous response from people through emails, and we just want to thank everyone who wrote to us, and we want to encourage as many of you to write in, not only for what we're discussing on the show, but also if you have any ideas for topics that we can present here on this program. So I know, Steve, you wanted to talk about one particular email that we got. Right.
We got one email on our from Glenn Goodrich, who said, one song I didn't hear mentioned was Ain't No Sunshine on Paul's Unplugged CD, even though Hamish sang lead on the song. And he also mentions that Bill Withers and Ringo were both inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame together. So that's a good point. Thank you, Glenn, for mentioning that. And you had, Ken, you were going to mention one.
Well, as often happens when the show is over, I end up saying, why didn't I say this? But there's one, to me at least, that's a glaring omission. But there's only one hit single that John Lennon had in his solo career that he didn't write. And that song was Stand By Me, which, of course, was a huge hit for Benny King. Actually, it was a hit twice over when the movie Stand By Me came out. But, of course, Benny King, one of our great R&B singers who not only had a great solo career, but goes back to his days with the Drifters. So, that was one where I just said, how can I not say that one?
Yeah, and he passed away last year, too.
Just within the last year, yeah.
So, yeah.
And also, I remember Julian saying that was a real favorite of his father's, and Julian went on to perform the song live, and even there was a video made on Julian that was called Stand By Me. So, there you go. Also, before we get to our topic, major news that broke today, and we're doing the show on the 25th of January, about Ringo announcing dates, U.S. dates for this year. And you want to tell us more about that, Steve?
The dates are all over the country. The tour starts June 3rd in Syracuse, New York, and July 2nd in Los Angeles at the Greek Theater, which he's played many times before on tour. And it's going to go all over the country. It's going to be it's not one of these little short jaunts. He's going to be doing a lot of stuff. East Coast, South, Midwest, a couple of the mountain states, and on the West Coast. So if you're anywhere and if you want to find out where he's going to be, check the story I wrote on Beatles Examiner, and it's going to be the same group, which some people are not really, really pleased with. But in my opinion, I mean, they play as a unit and they play very well together, as opposed to older versions of the All-Stars that, were Ringo and guys. This is Ringo as one. The band is one now, and I think, and I think that's a good thing. So I'm hoping they do add a couple of different, make some changes and maybe even do a jam part in the show. That would be great, but who knows? Not up to me.
Well, they've all been great lineups, but there is one very interesting aspect about this, and we'd have to do the research to look it up. But I remember hearing while this last tour happened, somebody actually said to me, "Did you know that Todd Rundgren has performed live on stage with Ringo more than anybody else?" So if you were to add up all the dates from this lineup, and then don't forget he was in two other previous All-Star bands.
Right.
He's probably been on stage with Ringo and done more concerts than Ringo did with the Beatles. And then if you were to just take a look at this lineup, there may be more dates with this band than Ringo did with the Beatles.
Mm-hmm.
Which is astounding, if you think about it. That's how much he loves this band. But it's very likely that Todd Rundgren holds the record for being on stage at more concerts than anybody else.
This is the fourth year for the band. They've been they came together and he pulled them together in 2012. So, and considering they have done shows, all not only in the United States, but they've done them in South America. They've done them in Japan. I can't recall off the top of my head if they've done England, but it seems to me they have. You're right. Yeah, that's a good point. That of all people, I wouldn't have even guessed that would be the case. That Todd has played with him more than anybody else. That should be something that they should mention. That would be something that somebody should bring to their attention. So.
Well, if it is true, that I'm sure Todd knows.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But
anyway. Let's go on to our topic for today, which is Beatlesque music. And way back when, in the caveman days, when I was doing a Beatles program on WDHA in New Jersey, when Al and also Tom Frangione were frequent guests, one of the things that we did was to do a show where we featured Beatlesque music, artists who were influenced by the Beatles. And so Al was the start of that, really. You want to talk about that, Al?
Well, matter of fact, it was that goes back to an article that I did in the very early years of Beatlefan on just that very subject, Beatlesque music. It can be now. We're not talking about tribute bands. We're not talking the Fab Four and Rain in 1964. We're talking about records or artists who show a definite, obviously the influence of the Beatles is pervasive, but there are certain times when a group or an artist will show, either intentional or not, the overwhelming influence of the Beatles. Whether it's a lead vocal, whether it's the instrumental sound of the record, any number of things. And again, there are some groups whose sound is based on the Beatles. There are others, existing groups who perhaps devoted one album to that type of genre, if you will. So it's, it all falls under the kind of the umbrella of Beatlesque music.
Mm-hmm. And also remember, it all has to do with what we hear in our own ears too, because we can all hear things that other people may not hear. So
very much so.
And not only that, one other thing that I think is very easy to overlook here, there's a lot of artists out there who I would never think were influenced by the Beatles because their music doesn't show it, but they admit in conversations and in interviews that they're big Beatle fans. So the Beatles influenced so many people. It may not be apparent in the music. Like I was just thinking about this, Ozzy Osbourne, of all people.
Yeah, sure.
When if you watch the concert for New York and he meets Paul McCartney and he's fawning all over him, he's talking about how much of a big Beatle fan he is. You'd never know it from his music, other than the music Mark Hudson produced for Ozzy Osbourne. But it still could be. There's so many artists out there that love the Beatles, but it may not show in their music, or it may not show that much. But why don't we go around the corner here and find out from each of you? Let's just say a handful. Say if you want to list 5 or more artists that you think were influenced in some way by the Beatles. And in some instances, I'm sure it's going to be very apparent. But why don't we start with you, Al?
Okay. The first one is a record that was a top 20 hit in almost exactly 50 years ago, in the early weeks of 1966. It's a record called Lies by a group called the Knickerbockers, who came from my old stomping grounds in northern New Jersey. Their lead singer, Bobby Randell, had a uncanny similarity to John Lennon's singing voice, at least not on every song, but certainly on Lies and other tracks. I believe the follow-up I think was called One Track Mind, and other tracks on their first album. It was absolutely uncanny how much he sounded like John Lennon, and Lies is a great example of that. It's a hard rocking.
Well, it was a rave. I think you could pretty much call it because of the way they did it. I mean, they basically had a wild time with it.
There you go. Thanks, Steve.
You're welcome.
And as I said, it was a top 20 hit. The funny thing is that as I mentioned, that not everything of theirs actually had that kind of sound. For instance, the B-side of Lies is a song called The Coming Generation, which in fact I used to wrap up that 1965 series that I did on Facebook and Twitter. And that has more of the sound of, say, The Association, if nothing else. But certainly Lies is a great example of what you might call Beatlesque music. Second one.
Can I make a quick comment?
Sure, please.
I remember hearing that on the radio, and they were definitely getting the impression that, I mean, there were some disc jockeys, at least I think there was the impression that people were trying to be fooled that was the Beatles. Because it sounded so much like the Beatles. But on first hearing, especially if you didn't know who that was, before everybody knew who it was, you saw there were a lot of clues. I mean, they basically laid it out to do everything they could to make it sound like the Beatles. I mean, and that was one of the first records really that, I mean, outside of the copycat budget label stuff, of which there was tons and tons back in '64. That was one of the first records I can remember that actually kind of did that. That really tried to get away with that stuff. It's a great record, and when you hear it now, you kind of laugh at it and stuff. But yeah, back then it was funny to hear it so Beatlish. It was hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, the instrumentation actually is probably a little harder edged than most Beatles music at least to that point in time, but certainly Bobby Randell's vocal is a spot on John Lennon, not imitation, but certainly that style, that vocal style. The second one is an album that came out in the fall of 1970 by a singer-songwriter named Emmett Rhodes.
I was gonna mention him. I knew that you were going to.
all of us probably were.
Yeah, I'm sure. He had been the lead singer of a band called the Merry-Go-Round, who themselves had definitely a Beatlesque sound.
Oh, I love that record. Love that group. Love that group a lot.
Yeah, and his first solo album was released on ABC Dunhill in the fall of 1970, probably right around the same time as the first U.S. Elton John album. Mm-hmm. And I remember the first time that I heard Somebody Made for Me, I was absolutely convinced. It's like you were just saying, Steve, about Lies. I was absolutely convinced that this was either a new Paul McCartney record or maybe even possibly a new Beatles recording. Mm-hmm. He played all the instruments did all of the vocals, including all the harmony vocals, similar to what Paul did with the McCartney album. And the album actually reached the Billboard top 30. But it received a lot of FM airplay. This was back in the days of freeform radio where, they could actually play, the personalities could play what they wanted. And it's a wonderful album. Ken will disagree with this, but there are some people who have said that perhaps that album is the album that McCartney should have been.
I never heard that before.
Yeah.
Where did you hear that?
For a few people back, especially back in my days working in Sam Goody.
Uh-huh.
There were a couple of people who mentioned that. He did record 2 subsequent albums that were similar in style, but not nearly as critically or commercially successful.
I just want to say about Emmett Rhodes, that album really is a solid album throughout. And if you listen to it, it's kind of like what you were saying. There's so much on there that reminds you of McCartney. And I know that that's not what he wanted to hear, because that's probably all he heard, was that he was like a McCartney clone type person. Yeah. And anybody who was ever given like a comparison to one of the Beatles or all of the Beatles, it's really the kiss of death. And, there's a few songs on there, in particular, She's Such a Beauty, which starts off with a piano part you could hear Paul playing it. And even the lead guitar part is very McCartney or Wings-ish. So there's a lot of tracks on there where melodically it's something that you could hear Paul singing. And it's probably the most McCartney-esque album that wasn't done by Paul McCartney. And it's very sad. He actually got screwed by the record company, from which he never really fully recovered. And he has been working on new music, and I keep hearing that he either has a new album out now or it's about to come out. I've been hearing about that for years. But there's a lot of people who are big Beatle fans who know of Emmett Rhodes, who are following him. So, if you hear anything, I'd certainly like to know more about Emmett, and any new music that he might have coming out.
Well, actually.
Right. Yeah, Steve is on occasion. Steve has been giving updates.
Well, I mean, I interviewed Emmett in 2009, and it was the first interview he had given in a long, long time, and it was an interesting interview. I'm not sure if the interview is still accessible on Examiner. What I should do is republish it, but yeah, he was a very interesting interview, and yeah, he basically did get screwed, and he said, those old days were a nightmare. He also went through some personal stuff too. And the last I heard, he actually did put out something. I don't have it, but I understand that there has been some new music. But I actually heard from him in a year or so. I mean, I agree that music was fantastic. I think I definitely was gonna mention him too. But I think Alan, you were gonna say something too, weren't you?
So I was also going to mention him, and I have heard that he has something coming out imminently. But other than that, I don't have much to add. I mean, he's a very obvious choice. He especially his earliest stuff really does sound like Paul McCartney of the period, and so really, I don't disagree with anything that was said. So really, I've got nothing to add.
The early stuff's been reissued, by the way. It's on. Yeah. It's available. It's not cheap, as I recall. I mean, it's not outrageous cheap, but I mean it's not a regular low priced reissue, but there is some Emmett Rhodes. The vintage Emmett Rhodes stuff is out there, and if you don't have it or you just have it on vinyl or something, it's well worth. It's only there's a compilation from 69 to 73 that's only $18.99, which isn't bad. I mean, that's pretty good actually.
Yeah.
So. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's MP3s only or what, but yeah, and Rhino did a compilation years ago, but yeah, I mean there's some great stuff out there, and the merry-go-round stuff is on CD too. So there you go.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the third one that on my list is an album by a group called the Flamin' Groovies, who were in their first incarnation, they were kind of a garage band, semi-punk band, but they reformed in 1976 and recorded an album called Shake Some Action. That was released in June of '76, which was produced by Greg Shaw, who some people may remember as the publisher of Bop magazine back in the '70s, and Dave Edmunds. And this was just a couple of years after Dave had produced tracks for the soundtrack of Stardust, which was the sequel to That'll Be the Day, starring David Essex, and where he created this Beatle type group called the Stray Cats, oddly enough, especially since he later ended up producing the first album by the real Stray Cats, the Brian Setzer band. But Dave and Greg Shaw produced this album, and it was obviously very much done in the style of not just the Beatles, but the British Invasion. This was actually their fourth album, but it was the first one with a kind of '60s Britpop feel to it. And You Tore Me Down particularly has a very Beatlesque sound to it. Plus, they did a cover of Misery on the album. I mean, there are other tracks that are perhaps a little bit more in the vein of the Stones or other British bands of the time. But certainly, "Shake Some Action" by the Flamin' Groovies has to go into any list of Beatlesque music. The fourth one is, since we just mentioned Todd Rundgren a little while ago, is an album. It was actually the fifth album by his group Utopia. It was called "Deface the Music." It came out, interestingly, in September of 1980. So this was at the point where the possibility of a Beatles reunion or whatever was still a possible. And this one was definitely an intentional homage to the Beatles, much in the way that the Ruddles was. The tracks were using styles of Beatle music from all through their time together. The single from the album was called "I Just Want to Touch You," and that was released in November of '80. And it was, in fact, that song was originally intended for the soundtrack of the movie Roadie, but it was felt that it was so Beatlesque that it was rejected. And in fact, if you look on YouTube, there's a video for it with the members of Utopia dressed up in 1964 matching suits and haircuts. Todd with something approaching a Beatle haircut, and very much with video that's very much in the vein of the Ed Sullivan Show, things like that. It's definitely worth looking up. The album itself.
And I just wanted to say that a few years ago, I had the chance to interview Todd, and I talked about that very album, and the interview is on my website. And we talked about Deface the Music and very much what you just said, Al, how it all started with the song being in Roadie. But I didn't get a clear answer from Todd as to whether or not you look at that album as being an homage or was it a parody? I mean, what's the difference between a tribute and a parody?
Mm.
You know, I mean, it's borrowing heavily, I mean, very heavily from
Very
certain
heavily.
Beatles songs where
Yes.
you can pinpoint with every song. Well, there's a song called Life Goes On, which you hear strings in there where it's just like Eleanor Rigby. You know, so it's definitely lifted from a specific song. There's one particular song where they're borrowing from both Getting Better and Fixing a Hole. And, you know, you just know you can hear those elements from certain Beatles songs. Where do you draw the line? He never really answered that question, whether it's a tribute or a parody. So,
well, I guess
no, I don't know if you put this in the same category.
I guess it's
as
the
everything
same.
else, but
The same question would be, directed at the Ruddles. Was that a parody
Right.
or was it an homage?
Mm.
But to Face the Music actually got a rather lukewarm critical response, and the album only reached number 65 on Billboard's album chart. And the fifth one is kind of a curveball. Every once in a while, one of the boy bands will show the influence of the Beatles. I mean, there are some people that will say that the Beatles were, the original boy band. Of course, they were a boy band for about 15 minutes before obviously, the sheer weight of their talent took away any aspects of just being a boy band. But for instance, I can remember when Ken and I did that Beatlesque show on Ken's WDHA show, there was a record by New Kids on the Block that was out right about that time. I think it may have been Hangin' Tough. And I would have liked to have included it, but there was Ken told me there was no way that the then program director at the DHA would have allowed him to play a record by New Kids on the Block. But about you
have a good memory for these things.
Yeah. But about 10 years later, another very popular boy band, the Backstreet Boys, recorded a song that perhaps is even more Beatlesque. It's called "I Want It That Way." And in fact, it's one of their. It was released in April of 1999, and it reached number 6 in the U.S. It was actually one of their biggest hits, and it was co-written and co-produced by Max Martin, who is the grand high exalted mystic ruler of basically all of the current pop from the Backstreet Boys and Britney Spears all the way up to Katy Perry and Taylor Swift. And it has especially the melody. It has a very definite Beatles feel. But even though it has the basic sound of a Backstreet Boys record or of a boy band record, and I've always felt that in the hands of I don't know, a Glenn Burtnick, say, if you took that song, sped up the melody a little bit, took the tempo up a notch, and added some, say, 1964 period instrumentation, you would have a great Beatlesque record. And
interesting.
Yeah, that's the Backstreet Boys. I Want It That Way, and those are my 5.
Yeah, I've heard that record many, many times, but never connected it with the Beatles. But I'll have to try and listen with those ears.
Yeah, especially listen to the lead vocal, which again seems kind of, at least to me at least, has kind of a Lennon-ish feel to it. The sort of the call and response on the choruses. There's a lot of elements to it that at least to my ears are very Beatlesque.
Okay. You want to mention more, or should we move on to someone else?
Why don't we move on to somebody else?
All right. Let's go with Alan.
Okay. I don't actually. I don't actually have five necessarily, or I have about 70.
Yeah.
I,
Hmm.
in a way, I found it hard to limit because I think an awful lot of rock is, so obviously influenced by the Beatles that you could almost pick anything, including contemporaries of theirs like the Byrds, the use of
Sure.
12 string. And, even though the Byrds kind of moved in their own direction. But, nevertheless, I mean, and also Al had, I didn't think of Emmett Rhodes, and he was going to be one, and To Face the Music was going to be one.
Hmm.
But I thought actually, since we were talking about Todd Rundgren, and since he's a favorite of Ken's as well, I should perhaps remind our listeners that there was another Beatles connection with Todd Rundgren, which is that he wrote the music for Up Against It when the
That's
New
right.
York Shakespeare Festival
Mm.
produced
Right.
it. And Up Against It was, as most people probably out there know, written by Joe Wharton as the proposed third film script for the Beatles. And it obviously was never done, but the New York Shakespeare Festival in 1989 decided to put on to present a version, and they brought Todd Rundgren in to do the music, largely because I think the writer of the person who was arranging the script for the performance, which has changed a bit from what Wharton wrote, liked To Face the Music and liked Todd Rundgren's music in general. Although he, I did a piece about this at the time in 1989, and the author said that the Todd Rundgren album that he played for the directors was actually not To Face the Music, but Hermit of Mink Hollow. And then it was interesting that Todd Rundgren himself did not produce particularly Beatle-y music for that. There is, by the way, I think the songs from that show are out on a CD in Japan. I've heard a demo of it that I got at the time I did the interviews, and it may be that demo that's out in Japan, actually. But I just wanted to can I read a quote from what Todd Rundgren said about his music for this show? Okay.
Sure.
He says, "My music for this is typical of what you might have heard on Broadway 20 years ago before Jesus Christ Superstar. I have a real distaste for the so-called rock musical. I think it devalues the craft of songwriting for the craft of writing stage music. Rock is supposed to be music for the common people, which is fine in terms of satisfying a potential audience, but in rock musicals, you get not only the musical part of rock, but also the pointless spectacle as well. Andrew Lloyd Webber, to me, is the Broadway equivalent of Kiss. You have big smoke bombs, platform shoes, people dressed up as trains, and the music is unlistenable. My major influence in theater music are Brecht and Weill, Stephen Sondheim, and Leonard Bernstein. And the reason I wanted to do it stage musical style rather than in the rock style is that theater music is what I heard when I was growing up. My father didn't like pop music. What he liked was The King and I, South Pacific, Slaughter on 10th Avenue. As a songwriter, what I usually do is take a particular psychological characteristic I might have and drive it to a psychotic extreme so it becomes more graphic. It's no good describing something that's so subtle as to be uninteresting. So writing music for characters was not especially unusual to me. That was something I've wanted to do that was inappropriate in a pop context. So he used this Beatles-related opportunity to stretch and do something else, and also basically share my view of Andrew Lloyd Webber. But interestingly enough, he also
You should admire Todd more now for this.
I've always admired Todd.
Okay.
But it's interesting to me as well that he talks about how when he was growing up, in his house, listening to musicals was, part of his background because it was also in a way part of the Beatles' background, so a lot of the music, the other Todd Rundgren music, not just To Face the Music, but his earlier things too. have an aspect of what Candy Leonard would call Beatleness about them.
Mm-hmm.
And, and it's interesting that, in a certain way, it's not just because he is influenced by them, but he was also influenced by what they were influenced by. So,
Right.
So that was
kind
one.
of like the Beatles. Yeah, he's so influenced by everything around him. He's very influenced by Gilbert and Sullivan, and it shows a lot in his music too. So and you could point to certain songs, especially "I Saw the Light," very Beatley.
Yeah, absolutely.
But when I brought all this up to him, it's almost like, yeah, he's acknowledging it, but he also knows that he draws from so many different influences. He doesn't want to just come across as being, a product of the Beatles, which, he's a lot more than that. He's done so many different styles of music. He's all over the place musically. And so he kind of like the Beatles. So in that way.
Mm-hmm. So I guess my second mention, I'm going to take advantage of being the second person of the four of us and glom onto Electric Light Orchestra before anyone else can do it.
Sure.
And particularly, I would single out El Dorado. El Dorado came out at roughly around the time that John Lennon had said in his interview with Dennis Elsis, I think, that if the Beatles were together today, they would be doing what ELO is doing. He recognized the influence because El Dorado and other ELO stuff too is, it's all sort of the son of I Am the Walrus. It's not quite the, gobbledygook lyrics and that kind of thing, but the string writing and the basic sound, I think I Am the Walrus is sort of the fountainhead for all of that stuff. Now, in ELO's case, obviously, they got to that string sound from a different approach. I mean, if you go back to very early ELO, I mean, they had a cellist and I think a violinist in the ensemble, and they played a version of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, and they were sort of going for a semi-symphonic rock thing. But by the time you get to El Dorado, it's really sort of a different band. And El Dorado is, in a way, El Dorado is a kind of rock opera. Forgive them, Todd. But you definitely could see what John meant when he said that ELO is doing, the Beatles would be doing what ELO is doing. I mean, there was something he liked about their sound, their songwriting style, their use of strings, that kind of thing. And so, any arguments, amplifications?
Well,
no arguments there.
No, I'm not going to argue with you. I'm going to wonder though why you didn't mention the move and do you? Because
that's true. That's true.
That was really, I mean, and that obviously has Roy Wood and Jeff Lynne together, but that was also a very Beatles song. I'm sitting here compiling stuff while you guys are talking, trying not to repeat everything that everybody's already said, but that was the first thing I thought of when you said ELO was and when you did mention that. So
that's true.
There's another one.
There are certain songs that ELO did. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that they have a certain underground bootleg connection too, because one of the great Beatles bootleg labels, Melvin Records, I believe the only other thing that they put out apart from Beatles and Beatles solo things was a Move bootleg. So, obviously there's a connection there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think if you were to mention the most Beatlesque sounding hits of all time, and even album cuts, you have to include some ELO songs in there. To me, in particular, Telephone Line is one of the most Beatley sounding songs ever.
Mm-hmm.
Can't Get Out of My Head is in there. Turn to Stone.
Oh, God.
I Can't Get Out of My Head, I believe, it's on El Dorado, so I'm covered there.
Yeah, it is. And also Steppin' Out, which was one of the album cuts, really, is so Beatley. But you can point to so many of them. But it's not just the fact that it's the strings and you think of Walrus, but the melodies that Jeff Lynne writes are very Beatley. I mean, it's all from that whole influence right there, and it's so ingrained in them. It's kind of like Mark Hudson,
Yeah.
Mark Hudson and Jeff Lynne are two people that I call Beatle babies. And, Mark Hudson wears it on his sleeve to the point where he's only too proud to say that he's the biggest Beatle fan in the world, and he doesn't care what anyone thinks, and it shows in his music. Jeff Lynne, of course, you have to realize that all these artists have identities all their own anyway, but it's just so strong, the Beatle influence with Jeff Lynne, and he proved to be the perfect person to work with the Beatles on the anthology. And also, he got to work with Paul and George and Ringo, too.
Right.
With the solo records, too.
Right.
That brings up another thing, which is that around the time that Free as a Bird came out and Real Love, you heard a lot of people on Beatles chat groups really trashing Jeff Lynne, and I simply don't understand it. I'm sure perhaps our readers will write in and explain it to me, but like like Ken said, I think he's the perfect guy. He's not just glomming onto Beatles stuff. He is his own artist. He is, I think, the real thing, and so I just never understood all of the trash talk about Jeff Lynne that happened around that time. I thought it was perfect. And obviously George did too, and Paul wouldn't have gone along with it if he didn't. So there you go.
And there is an ELO Beatles tribute that's floating around called Beatles Forever. So.
They also mention Hey Jude in their song Shangri-La. Little piece of
So
trivia.
my third one would be a little bit obvious, I think, even more obvious than ELO, which is the very early Bee Gees. Particularly New York Mining Disaster 1941. They're like Lies. It's another record that came out and everybody thought it was the Beatles.
Right.
People used to say, and in fact, even DJs used to talk about it on the air when they played it. And I remember when I think I mentioned once before that when we did our radio show that I had heard an early airing of A Day in the Life, and then it was immediately pulled. I remember, telling a friend about it, and he said, "Oh, it must have been that group, the Bee Gees, you heard," because it was, but it wasn't. But yeah, the early Bee Gees, before they were sucked into the endless vortex and dark spirit of disco, actually. First several albums had a kind of Beatle-y charm. So
you always got to put a dig in there with disco, don't you?
You bet. Tonight I was able to get Andrew Lloyd Webber and disco into the same discussion, and haven't yet mentioned how much better Life with the Lions is than any of that stuff.
There we go.
But okay, satisfied. Was someone going to say something else in there about
just that the first Bee Gees album, Bee Gees First, or the first worldwide Bee Gees album, Bee Gees First, it was it came out in, I think, August of 1967, and it was almost like getting a second Sgt. Pepper that summer. It was that good, and the sound was that close to that of the Beatles.
And horizontal too, that
Yes.
sort of I thought upheld that promise a lot.
Very
too,
much so. Yeah.
Yeah, well, even
I have...
when they did Cucumber Castle, that was as Sgt. Pepper as you could get. That was crazy. And also even before Mining Disaster, Spicks and Specks, which is a great song. That's a wonderful song, wonderful, and they sound and like I think I mentioned when we were talking about doing this, they've also done on YouTube. You can find a number of Beatle covers by the Bee Gees that are absolutely marvelous. But
right,
so
my one big memory of the Bee Gees, and I happen to love the whole disco period of theirs. Sorry, Alan, but going back to around 1971. And I didn't really know too much of the early Bee Gees at that point. I was still fairly young. I remember I've Got to Get a Message to You being played. But I was in the Boy Scouts, and we were in Washington, D.C., and we were traveling on a bus. And I heard this record come on the radio called Lonely Days.
Yep.
And the first time I heard that song, I said to myself, did the Beatles reunite? Is this a Beatles song that I never heard before? And it wasn't just the fact that melodically it's so much like a Beatles song. The harmonies, of course. The early stuff from the Bee Gees sounds so Beatle-y because of the harmonies, too. But when they were singing Good Morning, Mr. Sunshine, like that.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of either Rain, the song Rain, like When the Sun Shines, or A Good Day Sunshine. It immediately made me think of the Beatles for that reason. And, to this day, if I had to pick, the most Beatley sounding songs that weren't the Beatles, that'd have to be somewhere in my top five. I mean, Lonely Days is way up there.
I got to see the Bee Gees on the One tour, and that was really we went to that show basically for my wife, who is a big fan and loved Robin Gibb, and but I liked him too, but I was overwhelmed how good that show was. That was just astounding, and we also got to see Barry last year, and that was equally as good, although obviously it would have been, not having the group wasn't as, as good, but it still was a wonderful show, and I'm really sorry he has not apparently issued that show or issued that tour, because it was really wonderful. It really, really was. So,
all right.
Okay.
Any others, Alan?
Yeah, I have a few. Let me see. Should it be Tears for Fears or Elvis Costello next? I'm going to go with Elvis Costello. A lot of his stuff doesn't sound Beatley, and he's gone through all kinds of different influences over the years. But, the Beatles have clearly been an important influence on him, and it comes out in a lot of stuff. I think around the Imperial Bedroom kind of period and King of America. So I don't know if I can cite specific songs. I mean, I could probably cite a bunch of them, but not to mention I guess the collaborations he did with McCartney would be sort of out of the running by the rules of this discussion anyway. But those collaborations are in some ways some of the best work both of them have done in that time period. So I just want to mention Elvis as a not necessarily obvious example, but someone who's clearly very deeply influenced by the Beatles and whose music shows it. It's sublimated away into his own style, but it's really there. And I think maybe finally I'll do one that probably most people don't know. Any of you guys know Vinnie Zumo?
Heard of him, yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. He has an album called Swinging Guitar Sounds of Young America, came out in about 2006. Very Beatley. And in fact, the first song on it is called Fab Gear. But, there's a lot of Beatles influence of all periods of Beatles that comes out through his music. And he's definitely someone worth looking into. It's Vinnie Zummo. I know you can. I got this on iTunes. I'm not sure if it's out as a physical CD, but another guy who's working today, currently up to date, but very Beatley.
He's also issued tribute songs for each of the four Beatles.
Okay, I hadn't caught up with those.
Yeah, and he also had a period of time when he was in Joe Jackson's band as his guitarist. So.
Really? Okay.
And now, how about you, Steve?
Well, I have a long list, but I'll keep my comments short on all of them because I came up with a lot of what you guys did already. I'm surprised nobody mentioned Harry Nilsson's "You Can't Do That" and "Without You." Another one I would mention would be, since we were talking about Jeff Lynne and Roy Wood. One of my favorite Christmas songs is "I Wish It Could Be Christmas Every Day," and I know that's more of a Spector song, but I just Roy Wood just is great with his influence of the Beatles anyway. So I'll mention that. Another group would be World Party. Carl Wallinger it did a cover of "Happiness Is a Warm Gun" on "Thank You World," but a lot of his music is very Beatle influenced. Klaatu would be another mention, and I don't think we don't need really to go into the history of that. But yeah, Klaatu, who actually were masqueraded, or I shouldn't say masqueraded. There was I don't know how to put that, but I mean, people were thinking it was the Beatles, and I never really thought it was them, even though there was definitely they tried to be similar, but I didn't think I never really thought it was the Beatles, but that's another mention. That Thing You Do by the Wonders, the whole thing, the Wonders itself in the movie, That Thing You Do, was definitely, a nod to the Beatles. But that song, That Thing You Do, was definitely a Beatle tribute. I'll mention, like I said, I had a whole bunch of things to mention. I'll mention three more. One is the Monkees, for obvious reasons. Actually, I'll mention four. I hope I'm not taking away too much from you, Ken. One is the Monkees. One is Cheap Trick, Surrender, I Want You to Want Me, and Dream Police are Beatle covers. Here's one, Ken, I'm not sure if you've heard of this guy, Phil Keaggy. You know who Phil Keaggy is?
Sure I have. Yep.
Sure.
Phil Keaggy, who
very McCartney-esque.
Right,
Yeah.
and actually they did something together. It's been a long time, and I don't have the details on it, but they did do something together, or they met. I don't know. I know that they've been in contact with each other, and McCartney knows about him, and he knows about McCartney. And the last thing I was going to mention was, actually there were two, but I'll mention just one, is Have You Heard the Word by the Foot, F-U-T, which was actually Maurice Gibb of the Bee Gees, getting back to the Bee Gees again. And it was bootlegged as by the Beatles on several vinyl discs, way back then. And apparently, according to one thing I read today online, Yoko tried to copyright that song. No, I hadn't heard that, but apparently she thought it was a John song, which I think is hilarious. But anyway, yeah, I don't know if that's true, but that's funny. But anyway, there you go. That's my quick dash through there. I had others too, Maybe if we have a few minutes, I'll quickly mention the others, but that's it. Go.
Oh, there's so many of them. The best thing about this is that you'll mention something that I hadn't thought about for quite a while, but I had to put ELO at the top of the list just because so many of their songs are Beatle-y. And like I said before, Jeff Lynne, the way he writes, the style that he writes in, not that every song is, but sometimes there's a melody there that you could definitely hear John or Paul sing in particular, or maybe George. I don't know. But there's so many ELO songs that fall into that category. I had to put the Raspberries in there. The Raspberries really were a combination to me of the Beatles, the Beach Boys, and the Who all combined. I think Eric Carmen said that.
Yeah.
And, you take songs like Go All the Way, where you have that call and answer thing, which the Beatles borrowed from the girl groups, like we were discussing before. Same thing with I Want to Be With You. Several years ago, when the Raspberries reunited, they actually did two different tours. But the first time they reunited, I had the chance to interview Eric Carmen. And one of the things that I will always remember and treasure about that interview is that I had a chance to say to him, because Let's Pretend is one of my favorite songs that are non-Beatles songs. I said, it's the greatest Beatles song they never wrote. And it's really, it's a combination of Paul McCartney and Brian Wilson combined, what that would sound like.
Yeah.
So Let's Pretend is way up there as far as great, Beatlesque songs. There's a whole bunch of other songs in the Raspberries catalog. There's one called If You Change Your Mind, which wasn't a hit, very McCartney-esque. I hear McCartney in a lot of, Eric Carmen's music in particular, All By Myself, Never Gonna Fall in Love Again, Great Expectations, which was on the first solo Eric Carmen album. Moving on, I had to say Emmett Rhodes, definitely. Billy Joel. Billy Joel is someone who's had an amazing catalog, and he's one of the greatest songwriters. To me, there are times when there are certain songs that are very Beatle-y. Now, I know in particular we're going to bring up the Nylon Curtain, which is the one album that you point to, because there are certain songs there where it was just blatant. In particular, the song Laura. Laura is a song that, if you never heard it before, go on YouTube, listen to it. It's kind of like a mixture of Sexy Sadie with Hey Jude. It's got that 1968 Beatles feel to it, kind of a Lennon bitter song. And it's so perfect. Everything about it. The drumming, the guitar solo in there is very George. There's a song on that album called Where's the Orchestra, which is very McCartney-esque. There's one called Surprises, which is very kind of, I can't tell if it's more John or like Paul. But in particular, throughout Billy's career, there are times when melodically I can hear Paul singing the melody. Maybe not hear Paul sing Billy's lyrics, but the melody seems like something that Paul would sing. Don't Ask Me Why is kind of like a sped up And I Love Her to me. There's a song called Through the Long Night, which is on his Glass Houses album, and it's got piano and a French horn. So what do you think immediately when you've got that combination? So I immediately think of For No One when I hear that. It's just the melodies that Billy Joel comes up with just sound like something that has a strong McCartney presence to me in a lot of his music. Also, you got to mention Mark Hudson, the Hudson Brothers. I mean, come on. Like I said, it's written on his sleeve. Just listen to So You Are a Star from the Hudson Brothers, and that's one of the most Beatlesy sounding singles ever. You did mention Harry Nilsson. So much of Harry Nilsson's music, you can tell, very heavily influenced by the Beatles. You gotta say Squeeze. Squeeze is a band that, there's a lot of songs there that remind you of the Beatles. And Difford and Tilbrook often are referred to as Lennon McCartney, and I think they're kind of tired of hearing about it. Yeah. But in particular, when I was in college and I was on the radio there, Argy Bargy was a big album when it came out. And the song, If I Didn't Love You, my God, if that isn't a Beatlesy song, I don't know what isn't. I think if the Beatles were around in 1980, they would have a song like that. And there's also Another Nail in My Heart is a song from Squeeze that I could hear being very Beatlesy. There's a band that I remember only because this goes back to my days in New Jersey radio and WDHA when I solicited fans to send tapes in. There was a band, very obscure band called Sleepy Hollow. And I think they came out of New York. If you Google them, you won't find anything about them. There's a heavy metal band called Sleepy Hollow. That ain't them. This is a band that put out this one album, got a lot of Beatlesy songs on it, in particular sounding very much like John, songs that you could hear John sing. One called Take Me Back, which is, God, if you heard it right now, straight out of the Beatles songbook. XTC, you got to put in there. There's a lot of songs from XTC that I hear being contemporary Beatles, very off-center, kind of quirky. The stuff that Andy Partridge writes, I kind of feel like it's like where Glass Onion would lead you to, if that makes any sense. There's melodies that XTC comes out with where they're not typical melodies, but they kind of make sense. They go in a different direction. They're kind of quirky, but I can just hear like John do that kind of stuff. One of my favorite bands today is Keane, and some of their songs definitely sound Beatlesque. Certainly, there's a song on their Hopes and Fears album. You can all Google this, called Everybody's Changing. Listen to that and tell me that's not a Beatlesy sounding song. Or Somewhere Only We Know, which was the biggest hit they had here in the States. Keane, very keyboard heavy band, kind of like Coldplay. Cheap Trick, you have to mention. Voices is one of the most Beatlesy sounding songs I think they ever did. Oasis, I'm not a big Oasis fan, but you can tell a lot of their stuff is very derivative. Jellyfish was a band that came out back in the late 80s and through mid 90s, I think it was. They didn't put out much music, but a lot of it's very Beatlesy. And in fact, two of the guys from the band, Andy Sturmer and Roger Manning, they got to record with Ringo because they're on I Don't Believe You, which is on Time Takes Time. They wrote the song and they play on it. Anyway, so you want to add more, Steve?
Yeah, just mention three very quick things. The Sponge Tones are another band. If you look up their stuff on YouTube, they did Needles and Pins, which also brings to mind the Searchers, who I think were very unintentionally Beatles sounding, but I mean, a lot of their Needles and Pins especially was a Beatles sounding song, I think. But the one thing, one more song that I wanted to add, what may or may not be by the Beatles, it's called "Peace of Mind, the Candle Burns," that everybody.
Oh no.
That I'd love to know. I'd love to get that mystery settled as to whether that's really them or not. I mean, I don't think it is, but it's a great song. It's grown. Let's put it this way: I feel a lot better about it than I did back in the 70s when I first heard it on bootleg vinyl. But the endless mystery is it the Beatles? Nobody's come out and said no. At least didn't somebody asked Paul about that? I believe at one time. I believe there was actually at one of the press conferences way back in the 80s. I think somebody asked him, but who knows? And I think he couldn't remember, which prolongs the mystery. But there you go. There were the other things I was going to bring up.
Alan nearly mentioned this, nearly included in his list, Tears for Fears. I assume you're thinking Sowing the Seeds of Love?
Sure. Yeah, particularly that.
Yeah.
And I remember at the time that came out when there was a Paul McCartney press conference where someone said that they said they were influenced by the Beatles, and he said, well, I mean, they'd have to.
Yeah.
So, well, there's so much,
I
mean, everybody was influenced by the Beatles in some way or another, since 1963. So
Sure.
I'm surprised we came up with as many as we did, but I mean, we could have kept going. I mean,
Yeah, I mentioned Jellyfish before. There was a guitarist in the band, Jason Faulkner, who actually ended up playing on several tracks on the Chaos and Creation, the Backyard sessions for Paul. And I don't know, before we came up with the idea of doing this, we were debating whether or not to include Badfinger, only because of the Beatle connection there. And I just happen to feel that even if they didn't record Come and Get It, even if George Harrison didn't produce 4 of the songs on Straight Up, they still are very Beatle-y. And just the way that, the fact that it's a quartet, you got a bass player, lead guitarist, rhythm guitarist, and drummer. All of them wrote music. Even Mike Gibbons, wrote music and even sang a couple of songs in Badfinger. And you can always make the comparison that Pete Ham was the McCartney and Tom Evans was the Lennon and Joey Molland was the George Harrison of the group. So, if you listen to their music, they have this wide variety of styles and, great songs with great melodies and great harmonies. It's very easy to make a comparison between the two of them and see the similarities there. Obviously, they were influenced by the Beatles, but they also had their own identity, too.
Well, very much so. Yeah.
And people should be aware we purposely did not mention the Ruddles because of the obvious, we weren't trying for parodies. We were trying for real stuff. So.
Well, again, it was like we were talking before. Is it a parody or is it an homage? In the case of both the Ruddles and To Face the Music.
I think that it's
a fine line.
I think there's a huge difference when you create music that's completely original melodies and lyrics, and it's Beatlesque, as opposed to really taking directly from songs where it's so apparent, and that's where that's the difference between the Ruddles and the Utopia album, To Face the Music. Because you listen to Utopia, and every time you hear a song there, you'll say, oh, that sounds like a certain song. Doesn't matter what you pick. 8 Days a Week, Eleanor Rigby. You're going to say, oh, that reminds me of that song in particular.
Right.
Whereas you can take an ELO song, you can take Turn to Stone, and it's Beatlesque, but it doesn't sound like a specific Beatles song.
Right. Very true. Very true. And since you mentioned Keane, also you might mention the Paley brothers, who did an album on, I think it was on Sire, during the, I guess what you would call the skinny tie band period, around the time of the Knack and the and the Records and those kind of power pop bands. And their sound was also very, definitely Beatles influenced, and their Keane has a definite similarity in their sound to the Paley brothers.
Okay, I will try to check them out.
Yeah,
because I don't know the Paley brothers.
Oh, okay. In fact, Andy Paley later on worked with Brian Wilson.
Right.
Particularly on his first, I guess you would call his first solo album. The album that came out, I think, in '89, if I remember correctly.
Okay. Well, we certainly covered a lot of artists here in this show, and no doubt, I'm sure many of our listeners are thinking right now, but you didn't say this artist.
Right.
Or you didn't say that artist. So by all means, write to us, because we'd love to hear what you think about this particular topic and what we covered here. And, enlighten us, because I'm sure it's so easy to overlook certain artists, because this is such a wide topic here. There's so many artists that were influenced by the Beatles in a number of ways. And so we all just want to keep learning about this.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, that brings this show to a close. This has been a great topic. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can write to us at our email address at thingswesaidtodayradioshow@gmail.com. And by all means, keep the emails going. We love getting feedback from you folks. And you could also get in contact with us on our Facebook page as well, and on our Twitter account, which is what, Steve?
Things We Said Fab, with the little Twitter sign in front. So Things We Said Fab.
All right. So for Steve Marinucci, Alan Kozin, Al Sussman, and myself, Ken Michaels, thanks so much for listening to Things We Said Today, and we will see you next time.